Some men don't just face danger, they face the ghosts they thought they'd buried. Out here in the Wild West, one man's past comes roaring back when he finds her, broken, abandoned, and clinging to life by the river. What happens next doesn't just change her fate. It changes everything he thought he knew about justice, courage, and second chances. Where are you watching this story? Comment below. And if you love tales of survival and heroism in the Wild West, hit subscribe. Now, let the story begin. The river was unusually quiet that morning. Not the kind of quiet that settles over a sleepy town, soft and innocent, but a quiet that weighed on the chest, like the world had exhaled and forgotten anyone might be listening. I rode along the bank, horse hooves sinking slightly into the wet soil, and felt the emptiness inside me stretch wider with every step. I'd spent years avoiding people, avoiding trouble, avoiding my own mistakes, but they caught up in the end, in the silence I had refused to break. I wasn't looking for anything when I spotted it. Not trouble, not salvation, not even a moment worth remembering. Just another stretch of river that had been worn down by rain and time, mud cracking in the early sun. But something caught my eye, a movement that didn't belong. A burlap sack, suspended from the branch of a leaning cottonwood, swaying slightly, almost lazily. It looked ordinary enough if you squinted, if you ignored the kind of danger that rarely announces itself. I urged my horse closer, the leather creaking under my weight. The sack was torn in places, edges sun-bleached, and at the bottom, dark smudges marked it in ways I didn't want to think about. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest trace of human breath. Weak, labored, alive, barely. My stomach turned, and I dismounted slowly, careful not to make a sound. Inside was a woman, no older than 25, her dress ragged and clinging to her body in the damp. Mud crusted her ankles, bruises marred her skin, lips cracked and bloody. One wrist remained bound with rusted wire, the kind that leaves marks long after it's removed. She didn't beg or scream. She just whispered, as if the act of speaking had already drained her. "Just kill me fast." I froze, and for a long moment, we simply regarded each other in silence. I knelt, tugged back the thin blanket covering her, and saw what they had done, not to end her life, but to erase it. They hadn't left her to die. They had left her to disappear. And in that moment, I realized that finding her wasn't just chance. It was the first thing in years that made me feel something other than emptiness. I brought her back to the ranch. Dusty porch, 2 creaky chairs, a roof that whined louder than a man with a hangover whenever the wind swept over it. Nothing about it was impressive, but it was safe. She didn't speak as I tended to her injuries, didn't ask questions about why or how, didn't try to escape. She simply existed in the same space as me, which in its own way was a kind of communication. We fell into a routine, silent but profound. She sat near the stove, watched me work, flinched at the hiss of the kettle. I fed the livestock, repaired fences, and brought her meals, all while saying nothing. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It was a language I hadn't realized I understood. Days passed like this, and she began to move more confidently, touching the wood, brushing the dust from the floor, carrying water without spilling it. It was a fragile piece, and I knew it. Shadows move even when you think they're still, and the past has a way of sneaking up behind you, no matter how far you run. But for now, I let the silence speak, and for the first time in years, I felt it answer. Days stretched into weeks, and the riverbank where I had found her became a memory that existed only in the rustle of leaves and the distant caw of a lone crow. The ranch itself had begun to feel less like a shelter and more like a small universe of its own, one with boundaries marked by the fences I repaired and the creaking porch that seemed to grow louder with every gust of wind. She never asked for anything. She didn't even seem to want comfort, only the faintest assurance that she wasn't invisible anymore. At first, I wondered if I was the one who needed her as much as she needed me. The silence, the routine, the simplicity of tasks repeated day after day. It was like a balm for the empty spaces inside me. I had walked through life as if I were a ghost, passing by people, moments, and chances, never stopping, never raising my voice, never fighting for anything. And now, here was someone whose existence refused to be ignored, even if she said nothing at all. Mornings began with the same ritual. I would rise before the sun, the chill in the air crawling under my shirt, and feed the stock, check the fences, and make sure the barn doors were secure. She would appear eventually, usually at the stove, stirring the water for coffee or tea, her movements careful, almost ritualistic. Sometimes she would glance at me, eyes fleeting, then turn away as if she had been caught in a thought she didn't want to share. It was enough. That quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence was as close to conversation as we came. Her past clung to her like the scent of smoke after a fire. I could see it in the way she flinched at sudden movements, how she studied every shadow along the walls, how her hands sometimes trembled even when she was doing something as simple as picking up a cup. I never asked about it, though. I didn't need to. Pain carries its own voice, and in some ways, it spoke louder than words ever could. The rust of her chains, the bloodstains on her dress, the dried scabs on her skin, they were all chapters one could read without pressing her to tell me. I began to notice little things that marked her as a survivor, not just a victim. She found patterns in the routines I hadn't even realized existed. When the river would rise after heavy rains, how the fences would warp under the sun, the exact way the wind carried scents from town or the distant hills. She learned to move without making noise, to carry water without spilling a drop, to make small repairs around the house without needing instruction. It was impressive, almost unnervingly so. But I never told her that. Some forms of admiration are better left unspoken. There was a day when I realized she had begun to trust me. Not entirely, of course. She still kept the distance she had built, but there were moments when she allowed herself to exist outside the edges of fear. One morning, she stepped out into the yard without hesitation, lifted the axe to chop wood beside me. She was stiff, careful with each movement, but she didn't ask permission. I let her be, swinging my own axe in tandem, the rhythm of our work forming a kind of wordless conversation. I glanced at her once and caught the faintest hint of a smile before it vanished behind concentration. But peace has a way of whispering lies. Shadows do not remain where you want them, and the past doesn't stay buried, no matter how deep the river may run. I saw the first sign one afternoon while checking the perimeter. Fresh hoof prints, large and deliberate, pressed into the soft soil near the south fence. They weren't mine, weren't the neighbors', not from any townsfolk who might pass by. Something, someone, was approaching. The unease settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. That night, she moved closer to the fire than usual. Not close enough to speak, not close enough to ask, only close enough to remind herself that she wasn't alone. The oil lamp flickered, throwing shadows that danced across her face, illuminating the scars I had never seen in daylight. I cleaned my rifle in silence, each stroke deliberate, each movement a preparation I hoped would never be tested. And then I saw it, her wrist, branded with letters, crude and shallow, a tattoo burned into her skin like a warning. JKS. I knew that name. I had heard it years ago, in the drunken bragging of men who thought the world owed them pride. I had turned away then, told myself it wasn't my fight. But it was different now. Now it was her fight, and I wasn't going to be the man who turned away. I rode to Tombstone the next morning, not to confront, not to argue, only to listen. 3 girls had disappeared in the past months, 2 from Texas Doys, 1 from Santa Fe, all under 25, all gone without a trace. The sheriff shrugged, offered platitudes about lack of evidence and witnesses. I nodded, thanked him quietly, and left. Riding back, I felt something shift inside me. Something that had been hollow for years filled with a quiet but fierce resolve. This wasn't just about justice. It was about her. The realization didn't make me fearless, but it made me unwilling to stand idle. The silence between us that night was not empty. It was charged, heavy with unspoken understanding. I knew she felt it too, even if she didn't say anything. Her hand brushed mine, just for a second, and in that fleeting touch, a fragile trust was established, one that could not be broken without great effort. In the days that followed, the routine became a weapon in itself. We moved silently, communicated without words, and prepared for a confrontation I knew was coming. The distant hills and the riverbanks had ears and eyes, and I intended to use them to our advantage. Every creak of the porch, every shifting shadow, every flicker of sunlight through the cottonwood branches became part of a plan only I could see fully. And through it all, she observed, learned, and began to exist as more than someone who had suffered. By the time the threat finally arrived, I wasn't just a man protecting a survivor. I was a man who had found a reason to rise, to act, and to stand between the world and someone who had no choice but to trust me. The journey had not been easy, the silence had not been kind, but the understanding we shared was real. And in that truth, we both discovered that survival was not just about escaping the past. It was about reclaiming the present, piece by fragile piece. The wind had picked up that evening, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and pine from the distant hills. I stood at the edge of the fence line, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon for movement, listening to the subtle sounds of the ranch settling into the night. She was inside, I knew, pacing quietly near the stove, every step measured, controlled, as if the house itself could betray her if she misstepped. I couldn't blame her for fear. I had been carrying mine for years, tucked away, ignored, until it grew like a shadow behind my ribs. The hoof prints I had found days ago weren't a coincidence. Whoever left them was calculating, patient, waiting for a moment when the air was still and the ranch silent, thinking it could catch us unaware. But they had underestimated the quiet between us, the unspoken readiness that had grown over weeks of watching, waiting, and preparing. Night fell like a blanket, soft yet oppressive, the kind that makes shadows sharper, movements more distinct, and silence heavier than usual. I walked the perimeter, listening to the river rush over stones, the low groan of the barn, and the occasional distant cry of a coyote. Every sound was a marker, a hint, a sign that someone, or more than one, was approaching. By the time I returned, she had moved closer to the door, hands clasped together, as if gripping herself against the memory of what had been done to her. I didn't speak. Words weren't necessary. She didn't need to ask if I could handle it. The tension between us was a shared understanding. My eyes caught hers for a fleeting second, and in that silent exchange, I promised her that whatever came, she wouldn't face it alone. The first sign of them was subtle. A shadow against the barn wall, too high to be a tree, too deliberate to be a trick of light. Then a faint scrape along the corral fence, a sound that froze the blood in my veins. My hand tightened around the rifle, finger brushing the trigger, the weight of the weapon both a comfort and a reminder that the stakes had grown beyond routine survival. I moved quietly, covering our positions, scanning every corner, listening for the faintest hint of movement. They didn't rush, didn't announce themselves. The kind of men who leave marks like J.K.'s burned into skin know the value of fear, the power of anticipation. Their patience was a weapon, and they had sharpened it well. Hours passed like this, time measured in the rhythm of my heartbeat and the occasional gust of wind through the cottonwoods. She stayed near the fire, occasionally glancing at the door, watching, calculating, like a hawk ready to strike if needed. The shadows in the room grew longer as the lamp flickered, stretching across her face and casting her in a light that made her look both fragile and fierce. I realized then that survival had sculpted her, sharpened her instincts, even if she didn't yet trust herself fully. Then it happened. A low, deliberate noise outside, a footstep that shouldn't have been there, followed by another, then another. I slid to the door, rifle raised, eyes piercing the darkness. They were close, closer than I had imagined, stalking the edges of our sanctuary. Whoever they were, they knew the layout, the weak spots, the paths we took. But they hadn't accounted for me. They hadn't accounted for the quiet, the patience, the way I had watched, learned, and prepared. The first man emerged from the shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, face hidden under a brimmed hat. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator testing the air before striking. I fired a warning shot, the crack of the rifle echoing across the river, glass trembling in the window panes. He didn't flinch, didn't retreat. The audacity of men like this always surprises until it shouldn't. Another followed, knife glinting under the moonlight, and my instincts kicked in. I fired again, this time a close warning, the bullet grazing a fence post and shattering the stillness. They paused, assessing, calculating, and that pause, that hesitation, gave me the chance to act. I moved like I had been taught, like I had practiced in silence, closing the distance while keeping her hidden behind the walls of our sanctuary. I could hear her breath, shallow, quick, but steady, a small reassurance that she had placed her trust where it belonged. I wouldn't fail her. Not now, not ever. Every step I took was a promise, every measured movement a declaration that we would survive this night, that the past would not dictate the present. Hours blurred into a tense dance of shadows, rifle, and patience. And as the first streak of dawn cut across the horizon, painting the world in shades of fire and gold, I realized something. The night had been more than a test of strength. It had been a test of connection, of trust, of the quiet language we had built in the days and weeks before this confrontation. And in that understanding, we found a small but unshakable power, a power born not of violence, but of vigilance, preparation, and the unspoken promise to protect what mattered. By the time the sun rose fully, the men had vanished. I found traces of their passing, hoofprints fading into dirt, faint impressions along the riverbank, the remnants of a threat that had loomed over us like a storm cloud. But they were gone, and in the quiet aftermath, she allowed herself a small sigh, almost imperceptible, almost human. She had survived, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that we both had a chance, not just to endure, but to live. The quiet returned, not the oppressive, heavy silence of before, but a measured calm, a balance restored. And though the memory of the night would linger, it had changed us in ways words could not capture. We had faced danger together, and in the absence of panic, in the presence of shared vigilance, something fragile, something real had begun to grow between us. A bond formed not in conversation, but in survival, in trust, and in the unspoken understanding that neither of us would face the darkness alone. The next days were a rhythm of tension and quiet. I moved like a shadow along the riverbank, checking fences, scouting the edges of the property, and listening for the smallest irregularity in the wind. Every rustle, every creak, every distant animal call carried meaning now. The sense of foreboding that had arrived with the hoofprints lingered, thick and unrelenting, like a weight pressing against my chest. Inside, she began to reclaim pieces of herself she had long abandoned. It was subtle, how she stirred the coffee with a steadiness I hadn't seen before, how her hands no longer shook when she carried water from the well. Yet even as she adjusted, there were shadows in her gaze, memories she refused to speak aloud. They were there, lingering in the corners of her eyes, and I didn't ask. Words had a way of breaking delicate things, and I had learned that silence could sometimes hold more than speech ever could. I watched her one morning as the sun spilled over the horizon, bathing the yard in pale gold. She knelt in the dirt, planting herbs with a careful patience that reminded me of her resilience. Each seed she pressed into the soil seemed to grow a little hope, tiny green shoots pushing toward the light, as though even the earth understood the slow work of recovery. I kept my distance, but I couldn't look away. There was a quiet dignity in the way she moved, in the way she refused to let fear dictate her existence. The past, however, never truly sleeps. One evening, while repairing the corral, I noticed a figure in the distance. Not close enough to hear, not close enough to be immediate danger, but there, moving with purpose along the edges of the property. My pulse quickened, and I moved silently toward the house, rifle ready, heart beating in rhythm with the unspoken communication we had built. She was already at the door, waiting, her stance alert, eyes sharp. She didn't flinch when I stepped beside her. Instead, we simply watched together, two figures standing in the dim light, a mutual understanding between us that we were no longer alone in facing what was coming. I knew then that the threat would not relent, that the men who had branded her would come again. I could see it in the way she tightened her jaw, the way her shoulders stiffened. But I also saw something else: trust. She trusted that I would not let them take her again. And in that trust, a strange and fragile courage emerged. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was there, like a flickering flame resisting the wind. The nights became exercises in vigilance. I patrolled the perimeter, walking paths I had memorized, noting every landmark, every shadow. She stayed inside, near the fire, preparing herself for the possibility that the darkness might reach us. The silence we shared was no longer empty. It was a conduit, a language of precaution and understanding, a silent strategy that kept us alive. Each glance, each small movement was a part of that unspoken plan, a careful coordination born out of necessity and respect. Then came the first unmistakable sign that the past was returning in full force. A distant scream carried across the hills, raw and fragmented, echoing over the river. My body tensed, every nerve alert. She heard it too, but she didn't speak, didn't move toward the source. Instead, she stayed rooted, eyes wide, absorbing the sound as though it were a warning, a signal that we had no choice but to act. I waited until the sound faded, and then I moved. My horse followed quietly behind me, hooves muffled by the soft dirt. The river ran alongside, a silver ribbon under the moonlight, and I realized that this night was different. This wasn't a test of patience or silence. It was a prelude to confrontation. Whoever had tormented her before would come again, and this time there would be no hesitation, no opportunity to turn away. We had grown stronger in silence, in routine, in the unspoken bond between us. I knew she understood that I would not fail, and I also knew that she had begun to reclaim the part of herself that had been lost. The past was closing in, yes, but it would meet a force it had not anticipated, a force built not on anger, but on quiet resolve, on preparation, on an understanding that survival meant acting decisively when it was necessary. As I stood in the moonlit yard, scanning the horizon, I realized something profound. Our connection, fragile and unspoken, had become a kind of armor. Each day we had endured, each small act of trust, had forged something stronger than fear. And in that strength, I found a determination I had not known I possessed. The night was long, the shadows deep, but we would not be caught unprepared. Not again. And in the hours before dawn, as the first light of morning kissed the hills, I allowed myself a rare, fleeting thought. We were no longer just survivors. We were guardians of our own lives, and whatever came next, we would face it together. The sun was barely over the horizon when I first noticed them in the distance. 4 figures moving with precision, their silhouettes sharp against the pale morning light. I didn't hesitate. My hand rested on the rifle, every muscle coiled, every nerve alert. Weeks of silence, of careful observation, of preparation had led to this moment. The time for patience had passed. I signaled her to stay inside. She nodded once, a subtle motion, but it carried all the weight of understanding. There was no fear in her eyes, at least not the kind that paralyses. There was trust, and that trust was a weapon just as sharp as any rifle or blade. I knew she believed I wouldn't let the past take her again, and that belief made all the difference. I approached cautiously, moving through the tall grass along the riverbank, using the natural cover to mask my approach. Their voices drifted faintly on the wind, rough and careless. They didn't know I had been watching, tracking, studying their patterns. They had underestimated the quiet patience that had grown over weeks in the form of vigilance, observation, and the small, unseen preparations that had become our routine. The first figure raised a hand, signaling the others to slow. They were organized, professional even, the kind of men who leave traces like JKS burned into skin, who thrive on fear and control. But they had made a mistake, thinking the silence that had protected us was weakness. I wasn't weak. I had learned in the quiet how to move, how to strike, how to wait for the precise moment when action was unavoidable. I opened fire carefully, a single shot, precise, meant to warn and disrupt. Chaos rippled through their ranks. The first man ducked, too slow, his footing unsteady. The others drew weapons, moving with the sudden urgency that comes only when plans unravel. But I had anticipated this. Every step they took was a path I had already calculated, every possible escape route considered. The landscape was my ally. The river, the trees, the fences, even the uneven dirt underfoot. Every element became a tool, a weapon, a barrier against the intruders. One man lunged forward, knife raised, and I met him with the barrel of the rifle, striking him down before he could close the distance. Another fired blindly, the bullet slicing through air, missing by mere inches. I moved with a rhythm born of months of preparation, the dance of survival and justice unfolding in real time. I wasn't reckless, wasn't vengeful, only deliberate, measured, unwavering. Behind me, I could hear the faintest sound of movement, the door of the house opening slightly. She was watching, learning, understanding without needing words. Her presence, her trust, her quiet observation, it drove me forward, sharpened my focus. I wasn't fighting just for her survival. I was fighting for the possibility of reclaiming something long lost. Purpose, honor, a sense that my actions could still make a difference. The fight was brutal but brief. Each encounter was a test of patience versus aggression, strategy versus brute force. By the time the sun fully illuminated the valley, the 4 men were incapacitated, scattered across the terrain, each left with a warning that would linger in memory. No one would touch her again. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and earth. Silence returned gradually, settling over the scene like a blanket, heavy and complete. I returned to the house, rifle slung across my back, every movement deliberate. She was standing by the stove, hands pressed together, waiting, watching. I said nothing. Words were unnecessary. The glance we shared carried the weight of what had just occurred, the danger, the fear, the resolution. We had survived, not just by chance, but by design, by silent communication, by the bond forged in the long weeks of preparation and quiet observation. The aftermath was calm, but it was a fragile calm. I tended to her injuries, checked the perimeter once more, and began the slow work of returning the ranch to a semblance of normalcy. She moved with more confidence now, tending the garden, brushing the horses, reclaiming the life that had been stolen from her. And in the quiet, we began to share the same space not as protector and protected, but as 2 people slowly learning that trust, once earned, could become the foundation for something more than survival. That night, under the flickering light of the oil lamp, she allowed herself to sit closer, her hand brushing mine as we shared the quiet warmth of the fire. For the first time in weeks, she didn't flinch. For the first time, I realized that we had created something rare, a sense of safety, a space where fear had been replaced by trust, and silence had become language. The past would not leave us completely. There were always remnants, traces of what had been lost and what had been endured. But in that moment, the danger was gone, and we were left with something stronger. The knowledge that survival was not just about avoiding death, but about reclaiming life, piece by fragile piece. And in the stillness that followed, I understood something that had eluded me for years. Justice doesn't always arrive with a badge or a courtroom. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the hands of those willing to act when it matters most, when the silence has grown too heavy to ignore. And sometimes, in that quiet action, a life, maybe even two, can be saved. The dawn was slow that morning, bleeding through the window panes in muted amber tones. For the first time in weeks, the ranch felt like a home rather than a line drawn between safety and threat. She moved quietly through the kitchen, pouring water into the tin cups, her movements deliberate and careful, yet unshakable. I watched her, noting the small changes, how she held herself straighter, how her hands were steadier, how her eyes carried less of the haunted weight that had once been a permanent shadow. It wasn't triumph. I knew better than that. Recovery was a series of small victories, each one fragile and precarious, easily undone if fear returned. But there was progress, and that mattered more than words could convey. I didn't speak, didn't comment. Words had a way of breaking delicate things, and silence had become our language of trust. She understood it, and that understanding became a bond stronger than any conversation. I stepped outside, letting the cold morning air hit my face, feeling the rhythm of the land, the life that persisted even after danger had struck. The river ran swift and clear, carrying away the debris of past threats, as though the water itself knew our need for renewal. I moved among the fences and pastures, checking livestock, repairing a broken post here, tightening a loose hinge there. Routine had become ritual, a way to anchor ourselves amid the lingering shadows of memory. She joined me later, not with words, but with presence. She carried a small basket, herbs and vegetables freshly gathered, and for the first time, I felt that she was reclaiming something that had been taken from her. Agency, a sense of contribution, a place in this world that was solely hers. She moved with cautious confidence, glancing occasionally at the horizon, but her gaze was steadier, more measured than before. There was a rhythm to her movement, a pattern that spoke of resilience and determination. Evenings became a time for quiet observation and shared activity. She would sit near the fire, tending to small chores, while I maintained the boundaries of our sanctuary. The routine itself became communication. The way she stirred the embers, the way she moved around the room, the careful attention she paid to small details, all of it spoke louder than any words could. I had learned to read those cues, to anticipate needs and offer support without disrupting the fragile trust we had built. But the past has a way of lingering, of leaving traces that cannot be ignored. Footprints in the dirt, subtle marks on the edges of the property, echoes of threats that had long since faded from memory. They were reminders that safety was never absolute, that vigilance was a permanent condition. And yet, we endured, not out of fear, but out of a shared commitment to survival and to each other. One night, as the moon hung low and silver over the ranch, she finally allowed herself a small act of spontaneity. She hummed a tune while sweeping the porch, a simple melody, soft and hesitant, but unmistakably human. I didn't interrupt. I simply watched, noting the transformation, fear giving way to trust, trauma slowly being tempered by routine and presence. The sound, faint and fragile, was a declaration that life could continue, even after the darkest of nights. I realized then that our bond had shifted. It was no longer solely about protection or survival. It was about recognition, seeing the strength in another, acknowledging it without diminishing it, and allowing oneself to be seen in return. In that recognition, a quiet understanding emerged. We were no longer isolated individuals, haunted by past failures and losses. We were partners, linked by shared experience, mutual respect, and a commitment to stand against the shadows that lingered at the edges of our world. Days passed, marked by small, deliberate actions. She tended to the garden, brushing the horses with care, organizing supplies, and even attempting to cook a meal entirely on her own. I observed without intrusion, knowing that the act of reclaiming control, even over the smallest details, was as crucial as any physical defense. Each step she took was a reaffirmation that she could live again, that the past need not define the future. I, too, found a strange comfort in this quiet partnership. The weight of my own failures, the haunting memories of silence and inaction, began to lighten, replaced by the simple satisfaction of routine, of presence, of being needed and trusted. The silence between us was not emptiness. It was language, a dialogue of glances, gestures, and small, intentional acts that communicated far more than words ever could. And so, the ranch transformed into more than a refuge. It became a place of subtle reclamation, a sanctuary where fear and trauma were acknowledged but did not dominate. Trust and routine intertwined to form a shield stronger than any physical barrier, a network of vigilance and understanding that would endure even if the past attempted to intrude again. As night settled over the hills, we stood side by the fire, sharing the warmth without speaking. And in that quiet companionship, I understood a truth I had long ignored. Sometimes, survival is not measured by the battles fought or the dangers avoided, but by the small, quiet acts of trust and resilience that allow two lives to coexist, to grow, and to heal together. The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and pine from the hills. I noticed the change immediately, the subtle disturbances in the dust, footprints that didn't belong to any of our animals, the faint impression of boots pressed into the soft ground. My gut tightened. Weeks of quiet, careful observation had not erased the lingering threat. Whoever had tormented her before had not forgotten, had not abandoned, had merely waited. I didn't speak. I simply watched her as she worked the garden, her hands steady, her back straight, eyes scanning the horizon even as she planted rows of herbs. She hadn't noticed yet, and I intended to keep it that way as long as possible. There was no need to alarm her unnecessarily. Fear, after all, was as much a weapon as any rifle or blade. But preparation required awareness, and I had to act before the shadows became tangible. I rode along the perimeter of the property, careful to remain unseen. The river gurgled softly beside me, oblivious to the tension that had settled over the land. Each hoofbeat was deliberate, each pause calculated. I traced the fresh tracks, noting their spacing, the depth of each impression, the direction they suggested. These weren't wanderers or aimless trespassers. They moved with purpose, precision, and a familiarity with danger that only came from experience. They were coming for us, and soon. Back at the house, she was inside, methodically tending to the stove, stirring water, arranging the small items she had claimed as her own. I could see her awareness subtly shifting, the way she tilted her head to listen for unfamiliar sounds, the cautious pacing that had become second nature. Even in the stillness, she carried the remnants of trauma, a vigilant presence that mirrored my own. Night fell with an almost tangible weight. Shadows stretched across the land, merging with the darkness of the river and the forest beyond. I stationed myself by the edge of the barn, rifle resting on my shoulder, senses tuned to the slightest anomaly. The first noise came hours later, a faint scrape of boots against stone, a whisper of movement across dry leaves. My pulse quickened, but my body remained still. I had trained for this. Every instinct, every lesson learned in silence and observation, converged in this moment. The intruders were deliberate. They moved as if rehearsed, confident that the quiet routine of the ranch meant vulnerability. But they had underestimated our bond, the unspoken communication that allowed us to anticipate each other's actions. I could hear her breathing from the house, steady, controlled, a rhythm that anchored me. Our silent coordination was stronger than any fear, stronger than the threat looming in the darkness. The first figure emerged from the shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, knife glinting in the faint moonlight. I fired a warning shot, precise, intended to disrupt, and watched him flinch, reassess, and retreat slightly. Another moved forward, firearm drawn, and I reacted with measured swiftness, keeping the distance between us calculated, using the terrain, the fences, and the cover of night to my advantage. Hours of tension passed in a careful dance of patience and observation. Each movement they made was countered, each advance anticipated, each lapse in their coordination exploited. I could see the frustration mounting, the calculated arrogance of men who believed they had power over those who had suffered. They had not accounted for vigilance, for trust forged in quiet, for the precision that comes when fear is not allowed to dominate. Inside, she remained a quiet observer, moving only when necessary, her presence reinforcing the bond we had built. It was no longer just survival. It was collaboration, understanding, and a mutual recognition of strength. I caught her glance once, fleeting, and in it, I saw not fear but resolve. She was ready, in her own way, for whatever was coming. By dawn, the intruders had retreated, leaving subtle signs of their presence. Broken twigs, scuffed dirt, a sense of calculated defeat. But they were gone. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't merely the absence of threat. It was the recognition of resilience, the awareness that we had survived not through luck, but through vigilance, coordination, and trust. We emerged from the night changed. The quiet bond we had cultivated was no longer fragile. It was a shield forged in shared experience, an understanding that our survival was intertwined. The past still lingered, like shadows along the edges of the property, but we faced it together now, prepared, patient, and unwavering. And in that moment, standing together by the river as the first light of day stretched across the hills, I realized something profound. True strength wasn't in the weapons we carried or the battles we fought, but in the quiet trust we had nurtured, in the deliberate acts of courage that required no words, and in the unshakable understanding that whatever came, we would face it together. The night was unervingly still. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. I moved through the barnyard silently, rifle in hand, senses sharpened by weeks of anticipation. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest rustle of movement. I paused, heart pounding, ears straining to catch the rhythm of approaching danger. This was no longer a distant threat. It was here, and it was precise. I spotted them first. 3 figures moving along the edge of the pasture, careful, deliberate, their eyes scanning for signs of life. They had come prepared, but so had I. Months of observation, patience, and preparation had built more than just a routine. It had built an instinct, a reflex that allowed me to move before they even realized I was aware of them. The first man stepped too close to the fence. I didn't hesitate. A single shot rang out, precise, echoing across the valley. He stumbled, caught off guard, and I moved forward, exploiting the pause. The second man lunged with a knife, a foolish overconfidence that betrayed his training. I met him with the barrel of my rifle, striking him down before he could reach me. The third hesitated, weapon raised, calculating, but he had underestimated the terrain. I maneuvered through the shadows, the uneven ground and low branches providing cover, each step deliberate, each action measured. Inside, she watched from the window, tense but composed. She had learned the rhythm, the silent communication that had become our lifeline. A subtle gesture, a slight tilt of the head, and I knew she was ready to act if needed. Not to fight, but to support, to contribute in the ways she could. Her presence anchored me, a reminder that this wasn't just about survival. It was about protection, about reclaiming what had been stolen, and about standing for something greater than fear. The struggle was brutal but precise. Each movement I made was a response to theirs, each action calculated to minimize risk while asserting control. I forced them back, one by one, using the natural cover of the land, the fences, the riverbank as both shield and weapon. They were skilled, relentless, but I had something they did not. The knowledge that the person I was protecting depended on me, and that determination sharpened every reflex, every decision. The fight spilled into the clearing, the moonlight catching the glint of weapons and the flash of gunfire. I moved with a rhythm born of necessity, every shot, every maneuver precise. One man fell, incapacitated by a carefully aimed strike. Another ran, only to be trapped by the angle of the barn and the riverbank. The final one hesitated, indecision flashing in his eyes, and I used that moment to end the confrontation decisively. By the time silence returned, it was absolute. The intruders lay incapacitated or fled, leaving behind the tangible evidence of their intent: broken branches, disturbed earth, and the weight of failure. I returned to the house, rifle still in hand, but the tension in my shoulders began to ease. She was waiting by the stove, her hands steady, eyes calm. No words were needed. The glance we shared spoke volumes: relief, recognition, and the unspoken acknowledgement that we had endured together. The aftermath was quiet, deliberate. I tended to minor injuries, repaired fences, and ensured that every point of entry, every possible approach had been secured. She moved beside me, helping where she could, her actions deliberate and competent. The bond forged in silence and routine had become stronger than any fear, deeper than any shared peril. Our mutual trust had evolved into something almost tangible, a protective force as much a part of the ranch as the fences, the river, and the land itself. Days that followed were measured and intentional. She continued her tasks, each action reinforcing her independence and reclaiming autonomy that had been denied. I maintained vigilance, but not in paranoia. Each patrol, each check of the perimeter, was a ritual, a rhythm that kept us both safe while affirming our control over our environment. Silence was our language, routine our strategy, and together, they created a sense of security neither of us had thought possible in so long. By nightfall, we sat near the fire, the aftermath of confrontation settling over us like a heavy cloak finally removed. We shared warmth without words, understanding the gravity of what had passed and the fragile hope of what could continue. In that quiet, I realized something profound. Courage is not always loud, nor is justice always swift. Sometimes it is measured, deliberate, and grounded in the quiet actions that ensure survival, protect the innocent, and reclaim what was taken. And in that understanding, I felt something that had been absent for years: purpose. The past still lingered, yes, but it no longer held dominion over us. The shadows were still there, but our light, small and deliberate, pushed against them. Together, in silence and trust, we had created something enduring, a bond forged in adversity, strengthened by vigilance, and tempered by the shared recognition of what survival truly required. The first light of dawn spilled across the ranch in soft, amber streaks, illuminating a world that felt almost reborn. The air was still, the river whispering as if sharing secrets it had held for centuries. For the first time in weeks, we moved through the land without the shadow of imminent threat pressing against our backs. The danger that had stalked us, that had lingered like a predator just beyond the tree-line, was gone, for now at least. I observed her as she moved through the garden, tending to the herbs and vegetables with careful precision. The way her fingers brushed over the leaves, the slight tilt of her head as she examined the soil, the rhythmic motion of planting and watering, it was a quiet reclamation of life, an affirmation that she was no longer merely surviving, but existing on her own terms. She glanced at me only occasionally, with a subtle smile that spoke volumes more than words ever could. The morning chores were quiet, deliberate, and intimate in their simplicity. I repaired a section of fence that had been weakened by previous storms, while she tended to the chickens, ensuring their coops were secure. Each action was a reminder that life could continue, that the world was not solely a place of danger and loss, but also of small victories and reclaimed moments. We moved through our routines with a silent understanding, the language between us unspoken but complete. Later, as I checked the perimeter of the ranch, she followed at a careful distance, observing, learning, absorbing. Her trust had grown, and with it came confidence. Not the reckless kind, but a calm assurance in her ability to navigate a world that had once left her vulnerable. It was a transformation that had not happened overnight, but through weeks of careful rebuilding, quiet gestures, and shared survival. The evenings were a time for reflection. We sat by the fire, tending the embers, sharing silence that was rich with meaning. There were no words needed to convey gratitude, relief, or understanding. A glance, a shared sip of coffee, the gentle adjustment of a blanket between us. These small acts spoke more than any conversation could. In that silence, a bond had solidified, unshakable and resilient, formed in the crucible of danger and tempered by patience. I noticed subtle changes in her demeanor that had not been present before the threat had arrived. She moved with less hesitation, her posture more assured, her gaze steadier. She had reclaimed pieces of herself that the past had tried to take, and I had been witness to it, a silent partner in her resurgence. And in observing her reclaim her strength, I felt my own burden lift slightly. The weight of past mistakes, of silences that had cost more than I could count, began to ease. The ranch itself became a symbol of recovery. Fences repaired, gardens tended, livestock secure. Each element of the land reflected our effort to reclaim normalcy. The river, constant and unwavering, seemed to mirror our own resilience. Its steady flow reminded me that life continues, that even after turbulence and darkness, there is a current that carries forward, and all one can do is navigate it with intention. Nightfall brought with it a sense of peace that had been absent for too long. The stars stretched across the sky, unbroken and infinite. She leaned against the porch railing, her eyes tracing constellations, and I joined her, silent, standing beside her in quiet companionship. There was comfort in the simplicity, a profound understanding that survival was no longer just about avoiding danger, but about being present, witnessing each other's reclamation of life. For the first time, I allowed myself to relax fully in her presence, to feel the subtle warmth of trust without the ever-present edge of vigilance. We shared the fire, the coffee, the quiet moments that spoke of beginnings rather than endings. It was not love in the grand dramatic sense, not yet, but it was connection, fragile and nascent, strong enough to offer hope that life could continue in a way that was meaningful and mutual. And as the night deepened, I realized that our journey was far from over. There would always be echoes of the past, shadows that might return, and tests of patience and courage yet to come. But we had established something enduring, a foundation of trust, a shared understanding of resilience, and the quiet, steady rhythm of life reclaimed. In that foundation lay hope, not as an abstract idea, but as something tangible, built through effort, patience, and shared experience. The morning was brittle and sharp, the kind of cold that cut through fabric and bone alike. I mounted my horse and rode the perimeter one last time, checking every fence, every gate, every shadow that might conceal danger. The peace we had cultivated over the past days was fragile, almost fragile enough to shatter at the first sign of threat. And deep down, I knew it wasn't enough just to survive this time. I had to ensure that what had haunted her, and what had haunted me, would never return. The tracks appeared near the northern border, faint but deliberate. I dismounted, kneeling in the frost to examine them. Fresh, deep impressions, boots worn and purposeful. Whoever they were, they hadn't given up. But this time, I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. I studied their pattern, the distance between steps, the timing it suggested, and the terrain they had chosen for approach. They believed the darkness would give them advantage, that fear would weaken us. They were wrong. By mid-afternoon, the first figure emerged from the edge of the forest, a tall, broad silhouette, scanning the land. I waited, rifle steady, heart calm, every muscle coiled like a spring. He paused, sniffing the air, unaware that the world he thought he controlled was already his undoing. I let him advance, knowing the terrain better than he did, every tree and mound a tool, every shadow a shield. The confrontation was inevitable. As he stepped closer, I fired a precise warning shot, the sound cracking through the crisp air like a whip. He faltered, instinctively ducking, and that hesitation gave me the opening. I advanced, using the land as both cover and weapon, forcing him into the open. The other figures followed, emboldened by numbers, but I had anticipated this. My movements were deliberate, rehearsed through months of vigilance. Each step, each shot, each calculated retreat and advance was part of a rhythm designed to end this threat definitively. Inside the house, she observed quietly. Her presence was a grounding force, a silent affirmation of trust and resilience. She didn't need to act, but her vigilance was part of the pattern, part of the strategy we had honed together. A subtle tilt of her head, a glance toward the window. Our silent language communicated coordination, timing, and awareness. She was no longer merely a survivor. She was a partner, integral to the preservation of the life we had begun to rebuild. The fight moved across the clearing and into the tree-line, a precise choreography of action and reaction. One man lunged with a knife, only to be countered by a rifle strike aimed to disarm, not kill. Another tried to circle behind, miscalculating the angles I had prepared. Each threat was met with controlled force, calculated to neutralize without unnecessary escalation. They had underestimated us. The bond between two people forged in adversity, the silent understanding that allowed me to anticipate every movement before it became a danger. By dusk, the intruders were incapacitated or retreating in confusion. The danger that had stalked us for months, the echoes of past horrors, was finally extinguished. I returned to the house, rifle lowered, muscles weary but alert. She was waiting by the porch, her expression unreadable for a moment, then softening as relief washed over her. No words were needed. The glance we shared spoke of victory, of justice, of survival earned through patience, vigilance, and unyielding determination. The evening fell with a quiet sense of resolution. We tended the fire together, not as protector and protected, but as equals sharing the warmth of survival and trust. The past, with its shadows and threats, had been confronted and contained. The silence between us was no longer tense. It was comforting, full of meaning and unspoken gratitude. For the first time, I felt the weight of my own past mistakes lift, replaced by the awareness that we had done what we could to protect life, dignity, and trust. In the days that followed, life returned to a rhythm grounded not in fear, but in renewal. She continued her routines, tending the garden, caring for the animals, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had reclaimed autonomy. I maintained vigilance, but with the understanding that our world had been secured, at least for now. The bond we shared was stronger than ever, tempered by the trials we had endured and the trust we had cultivated. By night, under a sky ablaze with stars, we shared a rare moment of quiet reflection. I realized that the journey had changed both of us. The shadows of the past remained, but they no longer dictated our lives. We had reclaimed agency, safety, and dignity. In her eyes I saw trust, in mine determination, and in that recognition I understood that survival, justice, and care were not merely acts. They were commitments, carried quietly, deliberately, and with unwavering resolve. This was the culmination of everything we had endured, protection earned through vigilance, trust forged in silence, and the reclamation of life from the hands of those who would destroy it. The threat was gone, the danger vanquished, and the quiet that followed was not empty. It was full of possibility, full of a life rebuilt from fragments once shattered. And as I watched her, moving with ease and confidence, I knew that this was more than survival. It was beginning again, grounded in trust, resilience, and the understanding that the past could shape but never control us again. The first light of dawn was soft, almost forgiving, spilling over the hills and casting golden hues across the ranch. For the first time, I allowed myself to breathe fully, without the tension of lurking danger or the weight of past mistakes pressing against my chest. The river flowed steadily, a constant reminder that life continues, and that even after storms, clarity and calm can arrive. She emerged from the house, barefoot on the dew-covered grass, hair loosely bound, her face calm but watchful. The garden behind her bore the marks of her patient labor, rows of herbs and vegetables standing straight and proud, as if each plant had absorbed a fragment of the resilience she had reclaimed. Watching her, I realized that the true battles had not only been with the intruders, but with the fear, doubt, and pain that lingered from years of mistreatment. And now, those battles had shifted. They were over, replaced by a quiet strength that neither of us could have anticipated when we first met by the river. The ranch itself seemed to reflect our recovery. Fences mended, barns sturdy, animals safe and content, the once fragile routine now a deliberate rhythm of life rebuilt. We moved through our days without urgency or fear, but with intention. Chores became a shared practice, silent and efficient, punctuated only by small gestures of acknowledgement. A nod, a smile, a glance that conveyed everything words could not. The silence between us had become a language of its own, a testament to survival, trust, and mutual respect. Evenings were the most profound. Sitting together by the fire, we shared warmth that required no words. She began humming softly as she tended the embers, a quiet melody that seemed to weave itself into the fabric of the ranch, filling the spaces once haunted by fear with a calm assurance. The shadows that had once threatened to consume us now receded into memory, their presence only reinforcing the value of what had been preserved. There were moments when the past intruded, subtle reminders of lives fractured before we had met. A sudden gust of wind, the creak of a fence, a stray thought, but each time we met the moment together. She would look at me, and in her eyes I would see not hesitation or fear, but acknowledgement and trust. And I would return the gaze with the same understanding. We had endured, we had defended, and now we were allowed to exist in the quiet, to reclaim the possibility of peace without the constant vigilance that had once defined every breath. The days lengthened, bringing the slow warmth of summer, and with it, the rituals of everyday life. She brushed the horses without flinching, watered the garden, and began tending to small repairs herself, her confidence growing steadily. I continued my work, tending fences, checking the perimeter, preparing meals, but there was no tension, only presence. We were partners now, not in words, but in shared life, in the unspoken understanding of what it meant to protect, to heal, and to rebuild. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, we sat on the porch, watching the colors shift over the hills. She rested her head lightly against my shoulder, a gesture so simple, yet so profound. I realized that the weight I had carried for years, the silence, the regret, the mistakes, had lessened not through apology or words, but through action, through protection, through the quiet acts of daily life that had proven our resilience. I had saved her, yes, but in the process, I had saved a piece of myself too. The night deepened, stars stretching endlessly overhead, and I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. The danger was gone, the intruders defeated, the past acknowledged but no longer ruling us. Life had returned to a rhythm that was steady, deliberate, and profoundly human. And in that rhythm, we discovered not just survival, but connection, trust, and the slow, careful flowering of hope. In the following weeks, she continued to grow into her reclaimed life. Laughter, soft and infrequent at first, began to echo across the ranch. Meals shared became more than sustenance. They became moments of communion, simple celebrations of being present. The garden flourished, animals thrived, and the land itself seemed to breathe alongside us. I learned that courage and resilience are not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes, they exist in the quiet moments, in the steady commitment to another's safety and dignity, in the patience to rebuild trust where it was once shattered. And sometimes, in saving another, you find the fragments of your own soul restored, piece by piece, in the stillness of a shared day, a shared life, a shared quiet. We never spoke of promises. She never said she would stay, and I never demanded it. But each morning she opened the door, each night she returned, and each day we shared a silent acknowledgement that we had endured, and that endurance had transformed into something enduring, something that would not be broken by fear, by the past, or by the absence of words. As I watched her moving through the morning light, tending to the garden and the animals with grace and quiet strength, I understood that the story of our survival was not one of heroics shouted in the wind. It was one written in small gestures, in trust earned, in peace reclaimed. And in that quiet, resolute, and deliberate existence, we found something more valuable than victory, more enduring than justice, the reclamation of life itself, together, finally, at last. If you were in his boots, facing the same dangers and past you thought you'd buried, would you have done the same? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, and explore the other stories waiting for you on screen. Justice, courage, and survival. They're never simple out here in the Wild West.